Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary Salt.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
And today we are delighted to be joined by Henry Bolton. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you very much. Hi. Hello. Very pleased to be here.
Great. I mean, I would encourage people to look at Henry's CV online because when I was looking at it, it was hard to know what to pull out to introduce him. But so an ex-soldier, ex-policeman, ex-international diplomat, and we are so pleased to be joined by him when there's so much to talk about on international issues.
It feels like the right time to get you on, Henry.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll find out, won't we?
Definitely. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
So, Henry, can we just ask you to say a little bit about your political journey, first of all? So that, I think all our audience will be really interested in that.
Right. Well, I mean, it's been where it actually all started. I'm not quite sure because I started off, as you said, I'm a former soldier. Ever since I started off life in Kenya in East Africa, so I was born out there. My father was born there. My grandfather is buried there, and the sort of a bit of a military family in a sense because my grandfather was out there as a result of a scheme for injured former officers from World War One to go out to the colonies and establish businesses. So he got a grant to go out to Kenya with his he was 22 and his wife was 20. And they went out and set up a chili plantation in a place called Malindi. And anyway, so we've been over there for some time. Kenya got its independence in 1965. And then we returned shortly after that, because what a lot of people don't really know is that that Africa was rather like Zimbabwe went and so on. And so we all the whites lost their jobs. There was a question over the rule of law and tribal issues and so on coming to the fore, which had sort of the Brits had kind of kept a lid on. And so anyway, my mother and father felt it was time to leave. So in a sense, my earliest years were somewhat influenced by global events and the evolution of whatever. And my first, it's giving you a bit more of a history because it's sort of it's where it's shaped my politics. My first visual memory is actually of my brother drowning. I was just below. I was 4 and nearly 5 years old. He was just coming up for 2 years old, and we'd been very close because we'd gone through this sort of move together and so on. And it still left still today, huge gap. Sort of 56 years later or so. So the circumstances around that, nobody was to blame. But I look back on that moment and feel that he drowned. We'd been playing, he and I remember this, and he walked off, and he didn't come back alive. So he came back in my mother's arms. And it's, still chokes me up now.
Gosh, I can see, yeah.
But in a sense, although I wasn't even 5 years old at the time, it's left me with a deep sense of never wanting or allowing myself to be in a situation where I don't stand between harm and those to whom it would be done. Now, in the real world, you can't always do that. And so that's sort of shaped me going into the military. It's why I went into the army. It's why then subsequently I went into the police, and then why I went into I took the opportunity. I was offered it by the Foreign Office. I was never a civil servant, but I was offered the role, or the civil service. The Foreign Office rang me up one day and said, "Look, I'd been to Bosnia, and they said, look, we need somebody with a military background, Bosnian or Balkans experience and police experience to lead all the international police in Croatia, because after the Balkan Wars, the whole police service of the Republic of Croatia, as it had then become, or independent country of Croatia, had to rebuild its law enforcement and justice system and so on. And so, I was heading that up. And then Kosovo kicked off, and the Foreign Office then shifted me over to Kosovo. There were about 36 of us Brits. We were sent out there to monitor the fighting between the Serbs and the Albanians. So we were out there, hiking boots, fleece jackets, mountain jackets and everything else, armored Land Rovers. I was liaison to the Serbian police and paramilitary forces, literally with them as they were going out, sort of torching villages and fighting the Albanians. So for 5 months before the NATO bombing. So all of that started to shape, and I'd already been to Bosnia, shaped my whole experience and worldview. But I ended up as a United Nations governor, effectively, and they're called district administrators, of 2 districts in Kosovo after the NATO invasion into Kosovo, driving the Serbs out. Well, they left, as part of the agreement after the bombing. And I was asked by the United Nations to take the responsibility on the Security Council resolution for these 2 districts. And we're coming to the politics now, because there was no government. The Serbs had left. They'd been running everything. And so at local government level, we had to establish, I think there were 36 districts. I had 2 of them. We had to establish local government from nothing. So appoint the municipal board, the council, if you like. And I was president. I had to appoint members of the local society to that. I had to also put together the civil administration, which was education, healthcare, public utilities, the whole gamut, much more than local government is responsible for in the UK, and chair the military, NATO, and United Nations police security committee and so on. So all of that, and I had to put together the administration to run that as well from absolutely zero. And I was chief executive. So I was president of the council, chairman of the council, if you like, and presided over it. And I was the chief executive of the local government. Now, this is the thing. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244 had sort of instructed us, people in my position, to prepare the local political parties for the first elections to be held around a year later. First local elections, and because there were no political parties to speak of, and they had people had no idea how to set them up, nor did I. So
it had to be a quick learner.
As a soldier, thrown into that sort of role. So I wanted to study. I needed to study how to do this, and at that time, we didn't really have the internet. It was emerging. So Google wasn't quite what it is now. You couldn't just Google it, the constitution of a political party and so on. How do you structure a political party? I had no clue. So I then, the only way to find out was by joining a political party. So being a politically sort of quite naive at that point, I thought, well, I'm not joining the Conservatives. I'm not joining the Labour. I'm in the middle, the Liberal Democrats. So off I went, and I joined them. And that did give me what I needed to do the job. But as things evolved, I ended up then working for the European Union. I stood for the Lib Dems in Runnymede and Weybridge against Philip Hammond, the Chancellor. But I ended up working for the European Union as Chief Planner for Common Security and Defence Policy. And I was stunned at the detachment of Brussels from the reality of living in the member states. Some incredibly competent, very nice, very pleasant people to work with at the highest levels, well, throughout. Probably a lot more competent in some respects than our own civil service, but great people to work with, but detached from a lot of reality and had no concept of the value of the money that they were spending here, there, and everywhere, or the delivery of actual positive effect for the populations of Europe. And I was really quite shocked by that. And some of the and some of the implications of all of that, which we can talk about if you want. And I at the same time I was I was subverted in a pub one night in Brussels by a whole bunch of UKIP MEPs. We got very drunk, and I got sort of I came quite wayward and but I was very Eurosceptic by then and joined UKIP. And the thing is there that I felt that when we had the referendum, I wasn't leader in the run up to the referendum. Of course, Nigel Farage was. And we had I already by then, I was seriously concerned that no politician, including Nigel, had presented a vision to the country as to what we were trying to do. Yes, we wanted to leave the European Union, but nobody was trying to explain to the British people why. Well, we want to secure our borders, all that. But what's our vision? Where do we want to be 20, 25 years from now? What is it we aspire to? How do we want to be seen by the rest of the world, and how do we want to interact with the rest of the world? And where does leaving the European Union enable that? Because I truly believed then, and I believe now, that it does. So, in order to do that, whatever that might be, I've got my own distinct thoughts about that vision. We need to be independent in all areas of law, government, and public administration to make the choices, to make the decisions, to exploit the opportunities and so on that enable that to happen. So that's why we need to leave. But we never had that. And as a result, as I argued with Nigel, and as I've argued since very passionately with Nigel, not recently, and others, including Richard Tice, I've said, look, you have presented no vision. And because there is no vision, what we're going to end up with is this vacuum. We'll leave the European Union. Everybody will think it's job done because everybody's celebrating it. And then there will be nothing. And eventually reality will hit the road, and we're going to have to scrabble around and find answers to particular problems that raise their heads, rather than getting ahead of the game and having a clearly thought out sort of roadmap to take us towards that vision. How do we, that should have been what happened. So you get the vision, and then you develop what you need, you want to do out of that. What policies and decisions do you need to have and make to take you on that path?
And it feels like we're still scrabbling around, to be honest.
We are, because still to this day, Hilary, no politician, including in Reform, for all their words and so on, they don't come up with a vision for the future. Mm-hmm. They don't extrapolate from that vision a plan. And so, with my contacts in the European Union, I actually had a meeting with a very senior chairman of one of the I won't say which committee, but it involved the 28 ambassadors of the European Union, subsequently 27, of course, and the European Commission. A very important committee, and he became a good friend of mine, and we met in London. He was in London, and he said, it's absolutely amazing. He said, we were absolutely terrified that if you did leave, then you would just have you would swamp us with all of this plan, these objectives, how you wanted everything to happen. And all you did was talk about lily pads. And the lily pads that were talked about by Theresa May et al. And everybody, and still are to an extent, were actually the negotiating positions whereby where the Brits, in that whole negotiation about the withdrawal agreement and so on, was all, what is the London's perspective was, we don't want the political risk of going to Brussels and them saying no. So the first step is to identify those things, those areas that they are likely to agree to things on. And then we will formulate our requests based on that. So it's not based on what we want to achieve or our plan or our objectives, but what Brussels might agree to, so that they don't say no to anything.
You're losing us a little bit here now, Henry. So just explain that reference to lily pads.
Yeah, the lily pads. I don't remember this.
Right. Well, so there was a lot of conversation when we were after the referendum. There was a great deal of negotiation with Brussels as to what should happen next. How do we actually extract ourselves from the European Union? Where do we stay linked, and in what way? And in what way do we sort of diverge, and so on? And the negotiating position of the United Kingdom was, well, we are going to Brussels and asking them for their for their facilitation of what we want. But because London didn't have a clear idea of what we wanted in terms of trade or security or sort of rule of law or justice, cooperation and whatever, food standards, you name it, because we didn't know what we wanted. We went to Brussels and said, what would you like us to do? Where would you like to still have those relationships with us? And in what way? Does that make sense? And so what we were, before placing our negotiating position, before defining that, we would say to Brussels, what is it you would like us to do? Do you see what I mean? And so we defined an area of confidence of agreement. Does that make sense? Before saying what we wanted to do.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense? And in civil service and terminology at the time in London, those areas that we defined as something that we can agree on were called lily pads. Oh. And London was the frog, which would leap onto the lily pad. You don't want to miss the lily pad because otherwise you end up in the water.
Okay.
Hence that bizarre phrase, lily pad.
Yeah, we've learned something there, haven't we?
So how do you, because you're now a member of the SDP, how do you come to join the SDP?
Well, I took the leadership of UKIP, which is a necessary sort of part of the story, not because particularly I wanted it, but because after Nigel stood down, and then there was a period of about 9 months when a very nice guy, Paul Nuttall, took over the reins, but he exercised zero leadership. And as a result, the party fragmented. It was brought together under one cause, leaving the European Union. So it brought together a whole disparate array of political ideologies and opinions and whatever, and motivations. When we won the referendum, Nigel Farage basically said, job done, and walked away from it, which was very unwise. But the party started to fragment because Paul didn't give it another direction. So around certain personalities in the party, it fragmented. And then there was another leadership contest, and I threw my hat in the ring at the very last moment because I saw the other candidates lining up, and I thought, not one of these people is going to lead the party to deliver, to initiate and contribute positively to the national debate on what the vision should be. And I still believe that to this day, that somebody needs to do it. Where do we want to aspire? What do we want to aspire to be? And I felt that UKIP, having brought about largely been responsible for the referendum and for its results, had a responsibility to the country, in the absence of anybody else doing it, the government, to initiate that national discussion on where we want to be and developing that roadmap to get there. And I believed very strongly in that, still do. And I saw that none of those other candidates had either the nous or they all had separate agendas, very specific agendas, most of them. And I fell foul of those very quickly when I did become leader. So I threw my hat into the ring. I think nobody was more surprised than I was that I won it. I went on 2 tours around the country, speaking to the members, as I promised to do, listening to them. And it was all going rather well until it went rather badly. There were 2 problems. And it's all leading to the SDP in a way. I'd always, throughout this sort of story of UKIP, I had always been well aware of the SDP, always had a great deal of sense of empathy for the position of the SDP. But frankly, the SDP was, and still to an extent is, a very quiet voice. And, if you want to make a change, if you want to get into, I had an opportunity to go UKIP way and to project my opinion through UKIP at that point, which is what I chose to do. And from the very start, in fact, from the same day that I was elected leader, I was starting to get a great deal of pushback from members of the National Executive, 14 members of the National Executive. And they campaigned against me in the leadership campaign and afterwards. I had no access to the membership. I had no access to funding. I paid for all of my travel, everything myself. There were all sorts of things going on in the background. A lot of briefing against me in the media, a lot of briefing everywhere. I was holding my own against that until I made. We're human, and I'm not proud of what happened. But then I had an affair with this young lady, 30 years younger than me. Which again, I think I would probably have survived. I regret it because it split my family. I ended up losing the leadership of UKIP. I ended up having lost my savings because I'd spent them all on UKIP. So it was all to naught, really, because what I didn't know is that she'd sent some messages about Meghan Markle, which then were sold to the media. And then it all went, that gave the National Executive enough ammunition. But what the National Executive wanted to do was go down the route of bringing in Tommy Robinson, the Football Lads Alliance, anti-Islam, anti-immigration, and that was about it. They still considered job done with Brexit, and they didn't think that. And I wanted to bring the party into a sort of more mature position to actually contribute more generally to British politics, and so that brought about my downfall. Now, then I went through a very bad patch. I'd lost everything. My relationship with that young lady lasted a couple of years, 2-3 years. And then that went wrong. And so I've been picking myself up. As I've done that, I haven't lost my interest and passion for politics. And the SDP, I've come to realize, are just a really good bunch of people. Maybe it's because it's not that large a party, if I'm honest, but I share a belief with you that, we need to look after the United Kingdom. We need to reindustrialize. We need to be self-reliant. We need to interact with other nations on areas of common interest and concern. Absolutely. And you also, one of the things that was always a point of friction in UKIP between me and others was, I believe fervently, as the SDP does, that there are certain areas of public services, infrastructure, and so on, that really do need direct government involvement.
Yeah.
I've lived in many other countries in my journeys through life, including Austria and Germany, and they benefit greatly from having public services and utilities that are orientated not to delivering dividends for shareholders and so on, but to delivering in an empowerment way to the greater private economy. And whether it's railways, whether it's energy, whether it's water, I've always believed that, always. And so that's something that I think is fundamental. If government's not empowering the rest of society and commercial and business activity through providing that framework, that the skeleton and the blood vessels and so on that fuel it, that enable it to live and thrive, then you're always going to be struggling. So I think, and the SDP is pro Brexit, but we've got to do it in the right way. So it's all there. And the only reason I didn't go SDP before is because I got snaffled by UKIP.
So it's great to have you, Henry.
I was going to say,
the other thing to say is that just as a leadership style, William, who I've had the great pleasure of meeting a few times now, what a lovely bloke, really. And he listens, and you all listen. And so many other politicians are either too arrogant or aloof or insecure to listen, or they're too ideological to listen. But the SDP is, to me, a thinking party, which. So one can sit down and discuss, and your ideas can evolve, and I think that is something that the whole of British politics could learn from. So there you go.
So it's fascinating. I will echo Hilary's remarks. It's great to have you in the party, and I think we've got a lot of work to do. So I'm very excited. I wanted to ask you before. I know we're keen to move on to talk about diplomacy and everything, but I wanted to ask you just first. what drives you? What gives you that motivation? Because I think you'd be forgiven for saying, "Look, I've done my bit, and I've got the scars to prove it, and I can now step back." But you don't do that. You're sort of getting involved and being a voice. So what gives you that motivation?
I get upset. I get upset just thinking about it. I get very emotional, and that's goes back to Afghanistan and Kosovo, really. Which sort of triggered a sort of, I just let it go. But I get very emotional, and over, not angry, not, but I get upset when I see injustice, inefficiency, and I see people suffering, and I day in and day out. Whether it's my mother, who, bless her heart, she left us about 2.5 years ago, but she had bad arthritis in her fingers. But everything that she had to do was going online. She didn't know how to use an iPad. She couldn't, because she'd lost the feeling in her fingertips. She couldn't use it properly, and things were getting more and more complicated. And and for me, I said I went through a very bad patch. It's just, there's so much. If you are on top of everything, if you have a bank full of money, and you can pay all your bills on time, and it's all flowing out of your bank account, you don't have to watch every penny, then I suppose life can be, is fairly smooth. But that's not the majority of us. The majority of us are finding life more and more complicated, more and more complex, and therefore more and more stressful. And that upsets me, because that's fundamental. It's about people's happiness. And I've always said, I was saying this to Nigel Farage, and I still, again, I've always said it. If you can, people have a right to not to have things in their life that disturb their confidence, their optimism, their prosperity, or their security. And I think, actually, in a thriving society, you've got a state, politicians, civil service, all of these things that we create, the infrastructure we create, is there to enhance confidence, optimism, prosperity, and security. And if their feelings, it's not about, we earn more money than a German, or a whatever. It's not about that. It's, do we feel prosperous? Do we feel optimistic? Do we feel hope and so on? And I think the general answer to that question is no. And that upsets me, because there is no good reason for it. None. We've got politicians spaffing money on pet projects and ideologies and so on. They are not thinking about the ordinary person who is struggling, because no longer can one householder support the family, pay the mortgage, pay the bills, and so on, whilst the other looks after the children or whatever. I mean, I'm not talking, the sort of the old sort of school sort of male female sort of job descriptions in the home. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the pressure. No longer can families sit down and have breakfast together or have dinner together, and we're all suffering for it. And it upsets me. It doesn't anger me. It upsets me, because there are other people who just simply are out of touch with that. So there's your motivation. And until I lose the energy, which probably will happen one day, and until I lose the passion, and until that's for some reason I can't think that way. Maybe not far off. I'm going to continue, and it is exhausting. I've said to friends, look, sometimes I wish I could just, take a tablet and sort of eject this political thing out of my blood, but I can't.
Okay, well, I think we're very happy that you're still very keen to make a difference, and hopefully you can do that within the SDP.
I would like to help.
Can I move us on
to?
I think the thing we wanted to really talk to you about, Henry, given all of your massive experience, is given the very volatile international situation. We wanted to just explore a bit some of the problems there. So, You were indicating that there's a problem, perhaps not just about defence spending, which I think everybody is talking about, but a kind of wider problem about foreign policy and diplomacy. Do you want to just explain a bit about that to us? I'm conscious now that when I give you an open question, you really go at it. So I might just interrupt when we get to a point where
I have in Russian. There's a word called Bolton, which is close to my name, and it means chatterbox. So you do have to sometimes just. You're not going to offend me if you say Henry. Come on, move on.
Do you know I am from Bolton as well? That's the other connection here.
A lot of good people are.
Indeed.
I think the foreign policy can be about nationalism, which I'm going to stick my neck out here and say, which is really what Trump is doing in terms of his foreign policy, because if it's about trying to always put your own country beyond others, in front of others, as he seems to be doing, dominating others. You think of his talk about Greenland and Canada. And trying to dominate other countries. Now that to me is nationalism. It's not putting America first. It's putting America, it's suppressing everybody else, putting everybody else down, and exploiting others. And I think that's one way of approaching a foreign policy. Another way, and to a large extent, Russian foreign policy is about that. Having worked with both countries, the senior diplomats at Deputy Secretary of State level in Washington and Deputy Foreign Minister level in Moscow, having worked at both, they're both very different, but in that sense quite similar. Or your foreign policy can be about a more protective, in a diplomatic sense, defensive, without being insecure, approach to life, which is about, look, we have our interests, and we've got to look after the British people, but actually it's about protecting that. It's not about trying to exploit others or gain advantage over others. It's about working collegially with them, but protecting our own interests in doing so. So those are two subtle differences, and they rub up against each other quite strongly. There's a lot of friction there in some of the fora that I've been privileged to participate in. One in particular is relevant to the present situation. It's the OSCE Permanent Council. Now, the OSCE is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it's 57 participating countries, all of which maintain a permanent representative, ambassador level with a staff in Vienna. So think of it like a United Nations type of setup, but they deal purely with conflict prevention, conflict mitigation, and post-conflict reconstruction politically, and so on. And they look very much.
Why are those? Why is that a bunch of initials that we're not familiar with at all?
That's a very good question. In 2000, they are very good question. They are front and center of every major conflict that has involved the Northern Hemisphere, I would say, for the last 30, 40 years. And so it's a very good question. What happened was in 2008, the Labour government decided to pull back on the funding for it. They felt it was. I travelled with the Secretary General, in fact, to London and had a conversation with the head of the Director of Policy for the Foreign Office, trying to persuade London to do otherwise. But London's perspective was that this was a human rights organisation and an election monitoring organisation, which it does. But that there was no other relevance there in terms of security. They could deal with NATO. This was a fundamental error, because when you get NATO involved, you're talking about real prospect of military activity. You don't want to go that far down the road. And the job of the OSCE is to ensure that tensions, conflicts, whatever, diplomatic, political conflicts don't reach that point. And so there was a major, the UK had contributed, I think it was about 18% of the OSCE budget until then. And with pulling that out, seriously weakened not only the funding but also the status of the organisation. We're just talking generally here, so tell me if you want to jump on any of these things. But there's an interesting element to that, because one of the things that motivated Tony Blair's government in pulling the funding out of the OSCE was that concurrently to that was a great deal of talk in Brussels about expansion of EU foreign policy capability, setting up European Commission offices, embassies around the world. I think there's 147 of them now. The creation of a European army, a gendarmerie force, and the army and the gendarmerie force, as far as the European Union is concerned, is a way of giving more credibility to their foreign policy. So it's not actually about going out war fighting and so on. It's about, if you've got an army, if you've got a gendarmerie force or whatever as a lower level intervention, then you get more of a say at the table, in terms of foreign policy issues. And that's absolutely true. You do. But Tony Blair was not shifting, but the European Union wanted to exercise more authority on the behalf of the member states in all areas, whether it's trade, defense, foreign affairs. It's called the Common Foreign and Security Policy. And Europe's taken that on. And in fact, now, under the Lisbon Treaty, the member states are required to coordinate their foreign and defense policies, which is a seriously limiting factor. So Tony Blair's position was absolutely valid in that sense. If Europe's going to do all this work for us, we don't need to be doing it as well. That's duplicating. And you may or may not recall that at that time, the government was selling off all sorts of real estate. A lot of it's become hotels now, top-level hotels in London. They used to be civil service offices, had been pretty much since they were built, but not now. They've been sold off. It was all about that. So the OSCE, just so that people know, every week, all the ambassadors from Vancouver to Vladivostok, as they say, the Russians, the Americans, every EU member state, the Canadians, the Japanese, even the Australians have an affiliation, Israel, even, all the Central Asian states, Morocco, Algeria, they all 57 of them sit around the table, and I've had the privilege of chairing that group on a couple of occasions. All of those ambassadors sit around the table every week to discuss conflict-related issues. So in that, when people say, well, who's talking about Ukraine? Everybody's talking about Ukraine in that forum every week. And there are breakout sessions, and there's sort of all sorts. This is all conducted in the Hofburg Palace, by the way, in Vienna, which is a super venue for these things to take place. And there are always breakout, always there are bilateral and multilateral groups of ambassadors who go off to talk about various specific things. And its job is crucial to Northern Hemisphere security, because so many things are ironed out. So many conflicts don't go hot because that forum exists. And there are people like me and so on who would negotiate and mediate in those discussions. And it's tremendous. But why is this gone wrong? I think it's with Ukraine and so on. It's a long story, Hilary, and now it's been made more complicated by the Trump administration. So we're not specifically talking about Ukraine, I know, but sometimes diplomacy does fail. With the best will in the world, with everybody's passionate engagement to try and avoid conflict, sometimes it happens. And when it does, then the fallback position is, frankly, to have enough strength to provide a sort of cordon sanitaire around that conflict, to prevent it from expanding. And very rarely does diplomacy actually have a role in that. Not much of a role. It is about whether on the periphery of that conflict, expansion for any of the belligerents, if that expansion of conflict would be eye-wateringly painful for them militarily, or is beyond their capacity to deal with it, just geographically, logistically, or whatever. It's only when one side or another, and I think this is important to note, and in every conflict that I've been involved with, which is too many, but it's generally if it's left to a natural end, it is because one side or the other has run out of steam. Political steam, military steam, economic steam, but run out of steam. And at that point, there is an intervention opportunity. At that point, a third party, whether it's a country, an individual, or an organization like the OSCE, can jump in and go, right, okay, let's talk now. And you've got to be in constant contact to enable that to happen. And again, the OSCE fills that role. So I think that's what the European leaders were trying to do on Sunday, was trying to be in a position to exploit that opportunity should it arise.
Has it arisen, or are we still waiting for that? Has that opportunity arisen?
No, I don't think it has. I don't believe it has, and I don't believe it has because I don't want to get into an argument with people who are watching this as to it all, but the one leader who has not yet called for peace and an end to hostilities is Vladimir Putin. He is the man who initiated the military invasion. Okay, we can discuss till the cows come home why and whether it was justified or whether it wasn't, but he is the man who initiated military hostilities. He is the man who invaded a sovereign state. He is the man who is maintaining that offensive pressure. And he is the man who is not calling for peace. What he's doing is demanding, up until last night, certainly as spokesman, demanding that Ukraine hand over territory that even Russia hasn't yet occupied as a precondition for even participating in negotiations. So Ukraine wants peace, but it needs security guarantees, and we can talk about why that's absolutely valid.
What might those security guarantees look like in your experience?
That's not really possible to say, and I've been on social media a little critical of Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch, because they've been asking the Prime Minister, how many troops, to do what are the rules of engagement, and so on. The answer is we don't know. The first step is let's think about this. Let's scope the options. And let me explain. So none of this can happen, and as I've sort of explained, until there is that agreement, until the sides have run out of steam. But you've got to be ready to jump in there with a discussion. And now we can have that discussion because of what happened on Sunday. When you've got that agreement will identify whether there is a role for a military confidence building measure. And there's this particular doctrine called peace support missions, not war fighting, peace support. So to provide all sides of the conflict and the civilian population with the confidence that neither side is going to resume hostilities again. So it's a transparency thing as well as a sort of a little bit of a policing thing. But that agreement, whatever it is, and we haven't got an agreement yet, will define whether there's a role. If there is a role for a military force, that doesn't mean war fighting. It may be just monitoring, like in the Lebanon. There's a peacekeeping force on the border between Lebanon and Israel, for example. And there's one on the Golan Heights. There's many of these things. Cyprus, still a UN mission there between the north and the south. They're not war fighting roles. They're monitoring, policing kind of roles. That agreement will define the role, and will define what the parties will agree to in terms of the size and composition of that force, its authority, its rules of engagement, and so on. Now, what will be happening now, as we're talking, because the European leaders have said, look, some of us are prepared to think about doing such a thing, participating in such a thing, because we understand that that might be crucial to the parties agreeing to a peace agreement in itself. So the military planners will be spinning up all sorts of scenarios and options for the politicians, for the diplomats to go to the table with, during those mediation talks. So without an agreement, there will be no deployment. Without an agreement, there will be no definition of the mission. Without a definition of the mission, we don't know what size of force, what composition of force, and what rules of engagement that force will have for that deployment. So it's too early to say. But it's important diplomatically for the leaders to be pre-positioned to know whether or not, in principle, they would be happy to enable a peace agreement to be reached and hopefully to be sustainable, if necessary, by the presence of a third party on the ground. And the answer to that is clearly yes from some countries, and I applaud that. It's too early to discuss any of the other elements to it. But I used to do military planning as well at that level, and it's something that's a fascinating piece of work. And they will be burning the candle at both ends. They'll be working shifts doing this planning, and they'll be pretty close to sort of being able to present the Prime Minister and the Chief of Defence Staff with options that they can go to the table with. But all of that is dependent on agreement. So
can I just check in with you that I've maybe understood some of what you're saying? So are you saying that the OSCE is potentially a forum in which the UK might re-establish some credibility and a diplomatic presence for the country?
Hilary, that's a very astute question. The answer is yes.
Great, okay. And if that is a way for the UK to almost start to reinvent itself on a world stage, does that feed back into the earlier thing that you were saying, that there's a real problem now and that there's no vision for the UK? Could those two things mesh together?
Yeah, the latter sort of really leads to the former. So your first thing is your vision. What is it you aspire to be? So a confident, optimistic, prosperous, and secure nation that is seen by its friends and allies abroad as a firm and reliable outward-looking trading partner, something like that, whatever. Now, okay. Out of that, you extrapolate, okay, we want to be outward looking. We're looking at the rest of the world, but it's about being confident and optimistic ourselves. So confidence comes from fitness, health, and in everything, including your security, and security is part of it. So to do that, I mean, there are a lot of people, Hilary, sorry, I'm all over the place, but there are a lot of people who think that if we secure our borders and we withdraw behind them, then the job's done. Yeah. And they're being encouraged by many politicians to think that way. And the media, it's very easy thinking. But actually, all of these things that impact on us at home come from abroad. Whether it's illegal migration, whether it's cocaine, whether it's heroin, whether it's illegal firearms, whether it's Russian cruise missiles, whether it's whatever it might be, fake goods that are below standard and going to electrocute you. These are things that come across our borders into our homeland. But when they get to our borders aren't a big, 60-foot concrete wall with minefields around them. We don't want them to be like that. So we've got to deal with many of these things upstream, beyond our borders. And that means if we don't want conflict to visit us from nearby, then we need to try and mitigate that risk by trying to mitigate any conflict that does start to poke its head up. And so that requires us to engage in the rest of the world. And if we want to be seen as a nation, this is a conversation that the nation has. I've got my own opinions, but the nation needs to have that conversation. Do we want to be seen as a power and influence for good? And how do we define good? Human rights, justice, freedom, democracy around the world. If so, how do we do that? We can do it in a sort of Trumpian way. We can impose our will on other people. Our way is best, and we're going to try and impose that. To me, that's nationalism, where we think our way is the best, and we're going to impose it. We're going to get the rest of the world to follow it. Maybe Britain was like that 150 odd years ago, but not now. Or we can say, look, we're just going to use our influence, be just a good example. But to do that, we have to have that communication with the rest of the world so that they see that example. So we project it, we give them ideas, we help to support them to develop those ideas if they want to, not in the Afghan way where we try to change a society, that wasn't really ready or wanting change. So that requires us to interact. And then we say, well, where are our opportunities to interact? And the OSCE is certainly one. If I may, Hilary, sorry, but with Brexit, there was a great amount said that we are stronger, our voice internationally is stronger on the world stage in the European Union. That is absolute rubbish. And the OSCE is a great example. I think it's Article 38 of the Lisbon Treaty, as I said, requires the member states to coordinate their foreign policy. Right. Well, the way the OSCE Permanent Council, this crucial council, operates is that there's an agenda for every meeting, even if it's an extraordinary sort of emergency meeting. And then there is an opening statement made by any ambassador who wants to make it at the beginning of the meeting. And then you have a discussion on that agenda item. And before the Lisbon Treaty, the British ambassador could sit there and go, right, this is what Britain thinks, the opening statement. And every EU member state would participate openly in the debate and discussion during that agenda item. Afterwards, and the situation until we'd left the European Union, was that, because the Lisbon Treaty also says that the European Commission will act as the coordinator for that coordination. So before the meeting of the Permanent Council, the 57 ambassadors, including the British ambassador, the EU ambassador, the European Commission ambassador, will convene a meeting of all the EU member states and say, right, this is the agenda, right, what do we want to say? And they will agree amongst themselves a common statement, which if Malta says, sorry, we don't sign up to that, it doesn't get said. Okay, no matter how passionately the Brits think it. Then that common statement that's been agreed is read out not by a member state ambassador, but by the European Commission ambassador at the Permanent Council. And then you enter that debate, a free debate, presided over by the chairman. Any ambassador, the Tajik ambassador can say something. The American ambassador, the Canadian ambassador, all these different ambassadors, the Russian ambassador, Kyrgyz ambassador, whoever, can say what they want, but not the EU member state ambassadors, because they can't coordinate what they want to say with the other ambassadors. So the whole thing is dumbed down, and the only voice is the European Commission ambassador. So utter tripe that we had allowed a voice. Now we're back in that position. Now we can exploit that opportunity. Absolutely. Going back to your point.
So using that independent voice, it sounds like a real solution to me. Sounds like we've brought a solution.
You've got to be prepared. We are not in the habit, Hilary, in the civil service, in diplomacy, or in politics, of taking a forward-leaning role internationally. And this is that's one of the reasons I was very pleased to see. I disagree with him on just about everything, but I was pleased to see Keir Starmer take that initiative at the weekend, because it's heartening that somebody somewhere has had the gumption to say we might have a role in this, Prime Minister. The director of policy of the Foreign Office once told me there is, when I suggested that we took more of a leading role post-Brexit in European Common Security and Defence, in terms of influencing it from outside, not being part of it, he said, well, there's no appetite for that. That's the problem.
Yeah, okay.
So just to wrap up, I just wanted to say that a lot of my friends and family were very against the idea of Brexit because they would frame it as us stepping back from the world stage and withdrawing within our borders, like the Little Englander sort of characterization of it. It's refreshing to hear you talk about the opportunity that being outside of the EU offers us in terms of being able to strengthen our diplomatic relations with other countries.
Absolutely. And I could give you another example. I mean, that's very much the case. And it's probably, there are two reasons I really, in essence, that I wanted to leave the European Union. Yes, I saw the sort of inefficiencies of the European Union, but I actually felt there were a lot of things that the United Kingdom, historically, we have a lot of expertise and a lot of contacts and connections around the world, still good relations No, they're not as good as they were. But we could actually be a great example and lead many of the things that the European Union does from outside, but are constrained by being a member of the European Union from doing it. Yes, we're not at the table in Brussels, but actually that's a constraining factor rather than an empowering one, generally speaking. The other thing is that I tell you what, speak to a local councillor on a district council and ask them whether they get overwhelmed, whether they feel empowered being part of that local council, or whether the officers of that council overwhelm them with paperwork about planning applications and God knows what, and they find it very difficult to get ahead of the game. Right. Imagine that being the case for heads of government and ministers sitting around the table in Brussels, because the European Commission does exactly that with them. And they find it very difficult to get ahead of the game. They're led by the European Commission rather than lead the European Commission, however it looks on paper. From outside that, you're not encumbered with all of that. So you can still exercise that leadership and influence in a different way. The other thing is, another little thing I used to do, Hilary, was I taught for about 13 years, gave talks on the United Nations civilian staff officers course. So we're looking at the sort of people who are aspiring to be the special representative of the UN Secretary General leading international United Nations missions around the world. And I met on one of those courses a guy from Kenya who, my country of birth, but he was the head of crisis management in Kenya. And he told me a story. He said, until 2002, and I think he's got the date wrong, but anyway, 2003, I think. But anyway, the British ambassador could always be relied upon. Now, I don't know whether this is true, but this is something he told me. The British ambassador could always be relied on. He said if the German ambassador or the American ambassador, came to see a minister, a Kenyan minister, then they would know ahead whether this was to strong arm them or something. And the Germans and the Americans, so he said, had a reputation for doing exactly that. We'd like you to do this, but if you don't, we're going to do that. And he said, what would happen is the minister would pick up the phone to the British ambassador and say, look, George, would you pop round for a cup of tea? I've got the German ambassador coming in later, And so the German ambassador would arrive to give this minister a bit of a talking to and strong arm him. But the British ambassador would be sitting there drinking a cup of tea and would say, oh, I'm sorry, Minister, I've overstayed my welcome, I should leave. And the minister would say, no, Ambassador, you stay. I'm sure Hans won't mind. You stay. So, had that sort of effect. And we were always that sort of benign third-party friend. And that's how he saw it. That's not how I see it. But again, we stepped back from that when we gave the European Union the lead in foreign policy, when Tony Blair did that. And we've never taken that lead back. And when you think about it, we are going back 20 years, thereabouts, when that started to happen. And when that is a whole generation of civil servants. Most of the British civil servants or diplomats have no clue that that's how we used to operate. They're conditioned to operate in a very different environment. The only way to change that is through visionary leadership in government.
Great. That's a fantastic last few words to finish that section on, I think.
There you go. That's Hilary interrupting you. We were talking about.
He said it was okay.
Smoothly done.
Let's
the OSCE, Hilary.
So thanks, Henry. We're going to move on now to Culture Club, and we'll give you a rest just for a moment. And Sebastian and I will start. We've got a bit of a double-hander this week, haven't we, on Culture Club?
Yeah.
So
because so we're recording this on Wednesday. Yesterday was Shrove Tuesday.
Or Pancake Tuesday, as I call it.
Now, Shrove, what does Shrove mean? Do you know?
I don't know. It's something to do with the church, isn't it?
Yeah, to shrive, it's a verb. To shrive means to give absolution for sins.
Okay.
So the idea is that before this period of 40 days, which represents the 40 days that Jesus was in the desert being tempted by the devil,
yep.
Before this 40 days, you'd you'd go and you'd give confession, or you'd do confession, and the priest would give you absolution. He would shrive you from your sins.
Right.
That would be on the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. So the Shrove Tuesday became known as Shrove Tide.
And then Ash Wednesday, you have a little mark on your head, don't you? You have the ash put on your head when you were a kid.
Yes.
Why is that? Remind me why that is. You don't know. Do you know, Henry?
I don't.
No.
Oh, my grandmother would be appalled.
Yeah.
I think I might know, but it's certainly not. I'll get it wrong, so
Okay.
I won't venture into that.
Okay. I've told you before, haven't I, that in my gardening club, which is like all the volunteers doing the work down in the local park, we have quite a lot of the Chinese community come and join us. And so we do gardening, but we also talk about, I kind of tell them what all the plants are called and things like that. And we had a little discussion yesterday about Pancake Tuesday and Lent. I was trying to explain everything to them about... I remember when I was a kid, growing up in Bolton, for Lent, there would be, really hard drinking men who would give up alcohol for Lent. It's kind of it was the equivalent then of dry January now, although maybe less virtue signalling about it.
And do you know why people give stuff up? What the representation of that is?
So my memory from being a kid is that quite a lot of people didn't eat meat at all for the whole 40 days and 40 nights, and they didn't eat eggs and dairy, and that's why we had pancakes, because we used all that stuff up in the house before the 40 days and 40 nights. And it's all building up to Easter, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think that's why you give things up, because you're showing solidarity with Jesus. Is that
Yeah, essentially. So the idea was originally it was fasting. So you'd fast, like you were talking about, from meat or other things, and just like you say, you'd want to use up all the products that you've got in the cupboards that might go off, and so you'd have the fatty things and the stuff that might go off, bread and stuff like that. And then it became that Shrove Tuesday. It became a pancake thing because milk would go off and eggs and so on. I don't even know what goes into pancakes. Milk and eggs?
Yes, milk, eggs, flour, a bit of salt. Yeah.
And so in other cultures, it became known as Fat Tuesday because of the fat that you would be using.
Okay.
Mardi Gras in French. Have you heard of Mardi Gras?
Yes. Yeah.
That means Fat Tuesday.
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go. Learn something new every day.
Every day's a school day.
Whilst you've been chatting, I actually Googled the Ash Wednesday.
Yes, go on, tell us. Yeah.
And apparently, from biblical times, wearing ash was considered a sign of Google's gone off now. Of repentance. I've forgotten the word.
Right.
Repentance.
Okay.
And actually, when I was a child, and I this is a good sort of good moral habit, really, a self-reflective thing, isn't it? You go without, other people, this is rather what I was saying earlier, other people go without and they have difficult lives, often many much more difficult than our own. And we've all done things that maybe we were a bit selfish, a bit self-centered, or we were whatever. And the idea of taking some time to reflect on that is, I think, a healthy thing to do. It's not that necessarily that you make some sort of pledge, I suppose, to change. But, if you're aware, it's about self-awareness and emotional intelligence, I suppose. And it's encouraged. And it goes back to what I was saying about our, households and families being just too busy. Modern life is so intense that you can't sit down and you don't have a moment to sit and reflect. And if you do, you're too tired, or you've got a child screaming and shouting and you just don't have any bandwidth anymore to do this. And I think that's one of the reasons these things have sort of slowly faded from society within the space of a lifetime. And of course, a lot of these things, there's the, a bit political, but the influence of other cultures and other religions in the United Kingdom sort of getting a little offended, or people in the Church of England trying to sort of go out of their way to make other cultures and religions feel welcome, whilst to an extent having the effect of maybe undermining our own in that way, and these traditions and these quite healthy things. Even if you're not religious, the psychological process is probably a healthy one to go through.
Yeah, and one of the best ways you can welcome other people is by including them in these things that have formed part of our tradition and our culture for so long.
Exactly. Yeah. So they weren't too busy in my family for pancakes. So I had pancakes yesterday lunchtime.
Very good.
I took my dad. My dad's still lives in Bolton, so I took my dad pancake mixture at the weekend so he could do his own. My son Joe, friend of the show, Joe, has always been absolute, devourer of pancakes. When he was a little boy, he would eat like 20 on Pancake Day. And now he's in London. He hosts an annual Pancake Day
Wonderful
evening. So he had friends round.
Did you know? Now, not a lot of people know this, but being addicted, it is a thing. Being addicted to pancakes.
Oh gosh!
Now I know that because I went through a phase about a year ago of probably about exactly a year ago of just deciding, because I've always eaten pancakes. I've never eaten pancakes for breakfast before, but somebody I know does. And
I used to.
I was introduced to that, and since then, I went through months of not wanting to eat anything else apart from pancakes. But here's the crucial question for both of you, if I may. What do you eat on your pancakes?
Sugar and lemon. That's all.
You're only allowed sugar and lemon.
Yeah. So correct. Well, good.
So last year,
sort of people.
So an Indian friend of mine, she cooked pancakes last year, and I said we've got to do Pancake Day, and she said okay, yeah, I'll do pancakes. I go round to her house, and the oven's on. I'm like, what's going on here? And there's pancakes in the oven, and it's like a deep pancake with berries in it and stuff. And I said, no. We do them in the pan, and we do lemon and sugar. That's the way it's done.
That's it.
Quite right.
Correct.
I mean, because this, again, I don't want to talk about Donald Trump anymore, but the American pancakes are taking over, aren't they? And you get Nutella spread all over them, and and this isn't the same thing.
Not the same thing
at all. Different culture doing a different thing. I don't
ban
judge
it.
it.
That's why I say ban it.
Yeah,
it's not as good as the British pancake.
Exactly.
With sugar and lemon. No.
So, Henry, did you want to bring something to Culture Club?
Oh, good Lord! Do you think I'm cultured enough? I struggle a little bit with this at the moment. But oil painting. How about oil painting?
Lovely.
I do some oil painting, and I went through, I think I said, a very bad patch a few years ago. And my ex-wife, I spoke to her on the phone, and she said, "I'll tell you what, look, do some painting." I said, "I haven't got any money to buy any paintbrushes or anything. Didn't even have the money to do that." And she said, "Look, I'm going to send you 80 quid. Get yourself down to the shop and buy some paintbrushes and some paint." And I did, and I've been painting ever since. And it is the most therapeutic thing in this mad, topsy-turvy world that is almost unbelievably crazy. You can disappear into your own little world, shut all of that out, and just paint. I just paint. I do landscape stuff. Look, this one.
Oh yes, do show us.
You can't quite escape from politics because that's
that's beautiful.
It's fabulous.
But so you end up, it's a fabulous escape. Now, and if we want to link it to international events, isn't it a shame that President Putin has walked all over the reputation of Russia, their composers, their artists, the Bolshoi theatre, the ballet, a history and a culture, that's just almost second to none, second to ours, of course. But it's such a shame because it's something that you can really escape into, whether it's music, Rolling Stones or whatever it is, painting or cooking pancakes.
Mm-hmm.
I just think, wouldn't we all be more happy if we spent a little bit more time thinking about those sort of issues?
Exactly.
Yes. What a positive note to end on.
It is fabulous. Thanks so much for joining us, Henry.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry if I
don't apologise. We've been really pleased to have you, and we've learned a lot, and quite a new area for us. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, take care.
Thanks everybody for listening. Please do subscribe to the show, recommend it to your friends and family, and like it. and we will see you all next week. Thank you.